glad you come. Keep my father come.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah?
Listen, where's the other survivor?
It's that tall guy. Oh, there. He's from the television show. Survivor?
Right.
So here we are in a region of Australia where out of the world's 10 most deadly snakes, 9 of them inhabit this region. It was harrowing. You come across a taipan on the trail, you bit, you're dead. 30 minutes flat.
I'll tell you, that's a very interesting story. Let me tell you. I was in a concentration camp. You never even suffered 1 minute in your life compared to what I went through.
Look, I'm saying we spent 42 days trying to survive. We had very little rations.
Snacks. You're talking snacks. We didn't eat, sometimes for a week, for a month.
No.
We ate nothing. I went from
I mean, I couldn't work out when I was over there. They certainly didn't have a gym. Sneakers out, and then the next thing you know, I've got a pair of flip-flops.
Flip-flops?
We slept on the ground, on the dirt. Okay, 118 degrees during the day, 98 at night with 98% humidity.
45 degrees below zero.
Did you guys have a bathroom?
A bathroom?
We didn't have
We had 12 people at a time would go and shit.
Well, I'm sure you had toilet paper.
We had newspaper.
We had mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes. You see this glance eye?
Have you even seen the show?
Did you ever see our show? It was called the Holocaust.
Look, all I know is I was damn close to that $1 million, right? And the whole time, everyone's backstabbing me and undermining me, trying to get me kicked off the show.
You don't know nothing about survival. I'm a survivor.
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 Somebody get a sponge.
I don't understand. Why did you get a sponge? Well, I just don't know. I got a sponge. That's all. Okay. More.
Yes, thank you very much, Uğur, for your presentation, and thank you for inviting me. So, when you called me and asked whether I would be ready to come here to comment on your presentation, I was really very happy and also proud until I heard what the subject of your presentation is going to be. And some of the problems you mentioned in your presentation, I have to go through it now. So to talk to an audience, most of you are not genocide scholars or Holocaust researchers, and talk about humor on these topics, which, as Uğur said, is really something within a specific group. And I myself have never been thinking that I would be in a position like this. You have been talking about the surgeon who is not a friend of mine actually, and has never been, so to make this clear now. But after leaving high school, I worked at an emergency room in Finland, and this happened in my first week there. So I came from gymnasium, I was filled with ideas of humanism, and it's good to work here, even if it's bloody, to help and support people. And then one of the surgeons really said, well, of course, in a humorous way, well, I really wish this patient would die, since there is this soccer game tonight, and I do not want to miss it. And I was shocked, of course. I thought, well, what kind of place is this? There am I want to leave as soon as possible. But now, after 10 years of studying and teaching Holocaust and genocide studies, I can understand him some way, of course. But that's really the problem. It is something that remains within a group. It's cohesion, it creates a specific culture, but it's not so easy to keep the boundaries all the time. And so my job now this afternoon is to give you a few examples, or to tell you how does a genocide scholar deal with this fact, especially with the coping mechanism. So most of my friends and family members, they often ask me, how do you deal with this topic emotionally? I could not do what you do. It's too difficult. you have the impression that at family reunions people avoid me. They do not want to get in touch with me. They never ask how is your work doing. They just ask how is your family, and how are your friends, but nothing about my work. And what really helps, what keeps me doing this job, what keeps me investigating and doing research, this is black humor. So this is really this coping mechanism. And it helps us to deal with, of course, with emotional stress we have. So if you mentioned it, if you have to read one Holocaust book after the other, or if you get in touch with survivors, you do oral history, you have to do investigations. That's not an easy job. You can imagine it, and humor, really dark humor, helps. And sometimes there are very strange situations as well, and you have to deal with them. It's this incongruity. Yeah? You have different realms that overlaps, and it just does not fit. To give you two examples, I was eating a sandwich in Zurich at the bus station, and a car passed by, and it belonged to a transport company, and it was Eichmann Transport. So you really think, how can something like this happen? But of course, I'm from another context. I read about Eichmann every day. So this is just a family. They have a transportation company. So why not call it Eichmann Transport? But nevertheless, this really leads to disturbing. Teaching genocide. This is also very difficult. Also, of course, it is difficult for us. You said making a joke in public, this might really get you into trouble. But I also realized that students have a lot of difficulty in working on these subjects. So an example of it is a student of mine. He had to present a paper on the perception of Adolf Eichmann in literature, film, and public culture. And so he gave a serious paper, and at the end he said, and now imagine there are also Eichmann jokes, and I was sitting there and I knew something very bad is going to happen now, and he changed from a scholar to a stand-up comedian within his presentation, and it was like, do you know this joke? And he told two Eichmann jokes until I intervened and said, okay, I think it's good. And then I went back home and I told my wife about it. So she was not a very happy person, so she had to listen to all my complaints. And my daughter was also sitting on a table. And so next day my daughter came and she said, well, I told the Eichmann joke to my schoolmates, but they did not understand it. So this really shows you how difficult it can be. So if you work as a clerk at a post, and you go home and tell what bothered you during the day, and it's something else than dealing with this very sensitive stuff. Or another example, this was last semester, a student of mine had to give a presentation on the genocide in Darfur, and he was of course he did not do it on purpose, but he had a t-shirt and there was written, your life sucks, get a new one. So what do you do in such a situation? So I'm not a moralist, I'm not responsible for his dress code, but there are these situations that are really strange, and they disturb you. I think, I sometimes have the impression I live in a Woody Allen film because of all these situations. So, but humor helps. It really helps, and but what is important, this is what Uğur said, it's not an aggressive kind of humor. So it's not about blaming someone, it's not about there is no racism involved, we do not blame victim communities, of course we do not, but most of these jokes are about certain developments in the fields. As well, so the role of certain actors in the realm of memory politics, and so I was in Kosovo last week to study the nation building there, reconciliation processes in a war-torn society, and I realized that a number of persons gave very silly names to the children after 1999. So the first names are either Tony Blair, or Bill Clinton, or Madeleine Albright as first names. So this means that there are dozens of children now with the name Tony Blair Shachiri, for example. So this, of course, is an interesting phenomenon. Huh? So how does this nomenclature work? It's also a kind of remembrance to express gratitude to Great Britain or to the United States. But it disturbs you, again. But the most disturbing thing is, then I was told that Tony Blair, when he was not Prime Minister anymore and must have suffered from his new position that was not as significant as before anymore. So he went there and the people celebrated him and he met all these little Tony Blairs. And they were, you have to check it on YouTube, it's really amazing. And you do not know, should I now laugh or should I cry? So there are all these little Tony Blairs in their suits. They shake Tony Blair's hands and afterwards they all sing We Are the World together. So if you make jokes on this, it's not about this post-mass violence community, but about how politicians exploit these events, how they celebrate themselves as saviors, as do-gooders, and yes, that's the point. So I have now another video clip from The Onion. This is an online satire newspaper, you might know it. They also have video clips, and I'm going to show you one of their clips.
Jacqueline's Turkey presents.
Our top story at this hour, the investigation into actor Dalan Çiğdil continues today, looking into charges that the genocide in Darfur is entirely his doing. UN investigators believe Çiğdil orchestrated the Darfur genocide so that he could star in an uplifting movie based on the tragedy.
There are over 400,000 deaths because of Dalan Çiğdil.
He won acclaim for his stirring portrayal of the hotel manager who saved hundreds of refugees in a genocide, but admiration was the first step on Çiğdil's road to mass murder.
And the Oscar goes to Jamie Foxx.
Çiğdil's brave portrayal of a human rights hero lost out to Jamie Foxx's performance as Ray Charles, a blind man.
You put on a brave face for the camera, but he was absolutely crushed.
After his Oscar defeat, Çiğdil tells friends and family he will be starting work on yet another project about genocide. This one, quote, even better than Hotel Rwanda. 2 weeks later, he took the first of over 50 trips to Darfur, and that's when the killing began.
The Janjaweed militia was receiving a huge boost in funding, material from an unknown source, and we now know that that source was Dalan Çiğdil.
Testimony from Janjaweed leaders confirms that their orders came directly from Çiğdil himself.
يعني عملنا حتى الاتفاقات المشتركه من كل القبائل في القرى وحافظنا عليها تماما قبل الافغانيه واكثر منطقه الان
He chose specific villages for soldiers to attack, picking locales with panoramic vistas to provide a striking backdrop for his future cinematic adaptation.
He just pushes himself to be the best. And if that means starting a religious conflict where millions of people end up homeless or dead, that's just what Don will do.
In the days since the story broke, USA Films has said they plan to continue the project, but without Çiğdil's involvement. The studio is now in talks with Denzel Washington, who they say is very interested.
So I'm glad some of you managed to laugh, and another disclaimer, joke like this does not mean that the genocide in Darfur is not... That's my sponsor. They brought me here. No, this does not mean that the genocide in Darfur is not a serious thing and we should laugh about it, but it really criticizes the role of actors, of Hollywood celebrities, and there are many of them in the field of genocide research, and we really have to ask, what is the purpose Do they just want to do good? Of course they want, but they also want to promote themselves. And George Clooney and Dafoe, for example, it is also a very difficult relationship. The messages he promotes, they're much too easy. Of course, they shed light and attention to the cases, which is good, but what they propose, military intervention, so it is very simplistic, and this is a critique of it. And I think who has been talking about tensions, and this is also a way of how to deal with these tensions. So, ladies and gentlemen, these were just a few remarks to this very sensitive topic, and I'm looking forward to a funny discussion.
Okay, I think the floor is open for questions or comments or whatever you like to do. Jeffrey, please. Okay.
First of all, a statement, your English is too good. Secondly, I wonder if you would consider the role of humour as a facilitator. That's to say, a comedian voices the things that we all really think. That's to say, the surgeon saying to his friend, you know, I wish you would just die. They've all thought that, but they never say it. So the joke, it isn't just an in-joke. It's something that the comedian facilitates the things that we feel but dare not say.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Of course, I mean, if you're a comedian, this is a profession. I'm sure in the Middle Ages they had bards and professionals like that who would make fun of kings, for example. You get your head rolled off. But of course, in this case, we're dealing with profession. Many comedians, they even specialize. Some of them specialize in dark humor. Take someone like there's a Scottish comedian. He has exceptionally dark humor. He specializes in it. Forgot his name now, but
Frankie Boyle.
Frank Boyle, yeah, exactly. Frankie Boyle is yeah, good point.
Frankie Boyle had a great line on Margaret Thatcher. It was rumoured that there were going to be there will be a state funeral and it would cost £3 million. And Frankie Boyle observed that if you distributed that amount in Scotland, everyone could buy a shovel. And he said, and then we could dig a hole so deep that we could give her body to Satan personally, which is something we all thought, but we never dared to say.
Well,
thank you very much, both of you, for your very funny and also very interesting lectures. I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about the relationship between humor and power, because I think that a sort of common knowledge is that humor is an instrument used more by the powerless than by the powerful, but perhaps that is not true at all. But I just was wondering whether you could reflect a little bit more on that.
I think I agree with you. I mean, it's absolutely clear that very often humor that criticizes power is the weapons of the weak. When you're sitting in the Gulag camp, what else do we have left than a sense of humor or dissent? If you cannot voice dissent against the regime openly, then of course you create jokes, because jokes are informal. I tell it to another person, he remembers it, he tells it to someone else, and so the wildfire spreads. But on the other hand, we also have, of course, when people in power, their sense of humor very often is to solidify their own position of power. So there is, of course, there's self-humor, for example, self-sarcasm. But I think that this type of humor is rather rare. And when we're talking specifically about genocide, most of the humor is by the victim communities towards or directed at the perpetrator communities. So in that case, I think you're absolutely right. This is a weapons of the weak. No.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a question a little bit about, sort of picking up on what you just said, but also about coping, humor and coping. And I'm thinking here about Lisa Wardeen's Ambiguities of Domination, and she really deals a lot with the humor that you talked about with Ali Farzad and stuff. To what extent do you think that coping could actually be maintaining the status quo, because it's a release. But then at the same time it releases sort of this tension, but at the same time it maintains the status quo so it doesn't implode, but then you're continuing sort of what's going on. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, take the Soviet Union, for example. We have in the 1930s, around a ruthless regime. What would maintain the status quo is conformism. You conform to what the dictatorship is saying about itself, or the ideology, that would maintain the status quo. I don't see how. I think it challenges the status quo. Humor challenges the status quo.
But I'm just asking only because I feel like the regime allows for that humor to exist. It's sort of in a way regulating humor and regulating the resistance so that it can maintain its power. So to what extent is it really resistant?
No, that's a good point. I mean, there are rumors that the KGB, or maybe sometimes even some of the other secret services, that they produce the jokes about the regime in order to clamp down or to control the movement of dissent. And a joke has never brought down a regime, of course. So I think there's a good point there. I think only more research would point this out. When the KGB archives were open, briefly during the Yeltsin era, they didn't find much evidence of that. But they did find evidence of people who were thrown in jail because they were telling jokes. So it would be an interesting comparison to see which jokes were allowed and which got people beaten up, like this Syrian cartoonist. But it's an interesting point you're making.
A concrete example maybe for this is Ilya Ehrenberg, the Russian writer. When he was in Paris during the First World War, he was part of the group of Lenin and Trotsky before the First World War, actually. And he fell out of the group because they didn't have enough humor. They were too serious in his of course, Ehrenberg later was much more conformist than his friends. So maybe that's a little example of what she meant.
No, I agree. I actually agree. I mean, the only people, for example, if you look at ethnic jokes, which will get you lambasted in the United States to tell an ethnic joke. In many cases, of course, ethnic jokes are they challenge the status quo, but they're also, I think, very often stand with nationalists. The only people who think that ethnic identity is a deeply, deeply serious thing are nationalists. So if you would tell a joke about, for example, Milosevic or about Serbia in the mid-90s or early 90s, that could probably get you in trouble. So I mean, it's an interesting point also. I didn't know that about Edinburgh. Where did you read that? Sorry.
It's a Dutch writer who told us in his diary.
Which writer was it?
That I'm doubting right now because it was research from a couple of years ago. I'll get back at it. I think it's Ehrenberg. It's so.
You make a distinction between the three different functions of humor in let's say, around genocides. And the third one you mentioned is coping. But I was wondering if you thought about implementing, let's say, a kind of timeline or the element of time in your distinction. Because I was actually wondering whether coping still remains active as a function decades after the war. I mean, the example that you showed, let's say, the Holocaust humor from the early 21st century is about an event that has passed already 6 decades ago. Does it have to do more about with cohesion at that time than it does with coping? And do you know any examples, for example, about the Armenian genocide, where there's still jokes being made almost a century afterwards?
Well, that's a very good question. So you would say that the cohesion, of course, is a dynamic process. The victims are placed in a particular camp, for example, where the camp life ends, they return home or they go elsewhere. You would have to ask, I mean, maybe Nancy knows a few things about this. You know, what happens with the post-camp life? And what happens with camp culture after these people are released 10, 20, 30 years later? And do they still have Do they find the same jokes as funny as 10 years ago or 20 years ago? I don't know. It's a very interesting question. I think it's a very good question. I wouldn't know.
Well, if I could add to that,
Yeah.
I mean, some of them actually, as you said, did get into camp for being anecdotically, for telling anecdotes, and they still enjoy retelling them if you ask them a story about how they got there. So, also 50, 60 years later. And I can hardly remember any interview where I didn't learn some jokes about which I was very embarrassed during the interview, but you've given me some very good perspective on it.
Don't be, you just laugh at them. That's what they will enjoy as well. We're taking you along next time.
Yes, Uğur, and I liked both of your presentations, and it made me also think about the level of equality, of non-equality, when you're discussing the humor of people who are victimized or engaged in crime on one hand, and on the scholarly community on the other hand. And you made some remarks on the scholars, and I think us, basically, and I think you're suggesting for us it's about coping. The function of humor is mainly about coping, but accepting the fact that every act of humor is a way of including and excluding, may it also be the fact that sometimes as scholars of students of mass violence and genocide, we are trying to lift ourselves to the level of the community of the victim or of the perpetrators, or lift us into the same time frame. In other words, are we psychologically trying to be part of what happens by cracking jokes about the phenomenon?
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I've never. I guess that's it's a very sensitive issue. I think that, of course, as the scholars, as genocide scholars, our sympathies are instinctively with the victim group. So the culture of the victim group, including their humor, also it rubs off on us. I think this is also the reason why we know so many. I know a lot of Armenian jokes, for example, or I know a lot of Jewish jokes, like Amsterdam Jewish jokes, or Eastern European Jewish jokes. On the other hand, apart from coping, we would say that coping is really a problem for the victimized community. Not the victims. The victims are dead. The survivors and the victim communities. For us, it might also be, as I pointed out, a matter of cohesion, because only by telling these particular jokes, also about archives, for example, doing research in archives, or about interviewing survivors, for example. This is something that survivors don't do. We do it. So this particular act is carried out by us. So when we get together with other interviewers, this is about cohesion, about creating common ground, I think. So apart from coping, I don't disagree, but I think cohesion is really a major issue here. And this is also why you see at genocide conferences, we've been to many. During the conference, there will be seriousness and solemnity, because the audience might be mixed. But after the conference, when our colleagues hit the pub, all these jokes, they come out, of course, because that's the moment to be bonding. And it's a form of transgressive bonding, of course. But this is an interesting point. Are we trying to equate ourselves, or are we
make it kind of a relate activity?
Yeah, to relate to the victim. I think so. I think this makes perfect sense. Yeah. I also think that the jokes, just instinctively, the jokes told by victim communities are the funniest, because they make fun of people in power, whether it's Stalin or Hitler or the young Turk regime. So instinctively I would agree with this.
Maybe I can ask you a couple of questions. One of them is, does irony qualify as humor? The reason I'm asking is that there is a quite famous book by Paul Fussell about the First World War, called The Great War in Modern Memory, and he argues in that book that irony was the unique way in which soldiers who went through the war, particularly British soldiers, remembered their experiences. So it was a particular form of remembering and of memory. So I was wondering whether that applies also to the kind of topics you were talking about.
I think so.
Okay.
Sorry.
That answers the question.
I think so. I'm trying to run through the questions now so we can go to the drinks, right? I mean, that's what we really came to do.
Okay.
So,
we will in a minute.
I think that, of course, soldier culture. The moment that you are drafted, you went to the army or you went to combat. These are 2 or 3, I would say, funnels that you go through. 2 or 3 processes of intense bonding. And soldiers, of course, they have a sense of humor, which is rather inaccessible to most of us. And this is a product of maybe not only the remembrance, because that's one of the factors, but also of this process of bonding. They already go through a process of intense bonding. We don't. They don't put genocide scholars in a boot camp and make us do sit-ups and push-ups, and then we have to sleep in the same room for months on end. So that level of intimacy we don't have, but I certainly think that the intimate and transgressive forms of bonding, for example, killing together, also creates certain types of humor. To get back to this perpetrator thing, perpetrators have really morbid sense of humor. A process of maybe weeks or months, within weeks or months, they can do really, really nasty things to victims. Hanging them up, look, I'm going to chop off his head, let's see how far it's going to flow. So things like this, it's extremely funny to them. And this is because they've been bonding. The cohesion level is extremely high. Now, I think the higher the cohesion level, the more inaccessible the humor. So I think, fortunately, we're not at that level yet with genocide scholars. The heads haven't been chopped.
Okay, maybe I can ask another question. It's about definitions, because I was struck by the fact that many of the jokes that you told were actually about dictatorship rather than about genocide. So they were about, clearly there is a common element in the sense that these are jokes that comment on extreme imbalances of power, but I was wondering, do they all belong in the same category, or is there something that distinguishes one type from another?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You unfortunately discovered what I tried to hide in this presentation. Maybe this is my talk. This is a page of really inappropriate genocide jokes. I don't think that in this particular context I have to be sharing these. I think Dominik would be the only one who laughs, and maybe 1 or 2 others. So, this is the reason why I didn't really get into gas chamber jokes, but because they exist. And some of the best ones are told by my Israeli friends. But they exist, you're absolutely right. Yeah. The greater the imbalance of power, I think mass murder is a great imbalance of power, the more inaccessible the humor also becomes. But thank you for the question.
Okay, which brings me to the question. You want to ask another question?
Well, there's one thing I was wondering, because you were talking about cohesion, but isn't treating political correctness, let me phrase it that way, political correctness and not telling jokes to a mixed audience because you're afraid they might take offense of it, it's victimizing these groups as well. So you have a mechanism of telling these jokes and actually saying, well, I'm taking you more seriously than that. So is that a mechanism that you recognize? You know what I mean?
I understand what you mean. Of course, what I did here is respecting the boundary of our profession.
No. What I mean is that you actually, if you do make the joke, if you're friends with someone, you make fun of him. So if you do make a joke to a victim, which you maybe wouldn't dare because of political correctness and social conventions and everything, is actually an inclusive mechanism as well. Not pity the other and take.
I have very intimate friends. I crack jokes about them in their presence and sometimes in public all the time.
Yeah.
You can do that when you have intimacy.
Yeah.
But when I meet a survivor for the first time, I wouldn't go, hey, I wouldn't do that because the condition is not there. Whether it's a survivor of a mass crime like genocide, or somebody who survived a car crash, or a robbery, or somebody who fell down the stairs. And if there's intimacy, maybe. But if there's no intimacy, I think that becomes rather problematic.
Yeah, it's just another mechanism.
One final round of...
One more question. Who wants to go for drinks?
Yeah, we'll get there in a minute. Okay, so...
It's not a question, it's a La vita è bella. Life is beautiful. You said that you saw it in 2 halves. The first half you laughed, the second half you cried. I saw it as 3 parts. The first half I laughed, the second half I cried. The third half I got really angry because it lost reality. It was the point you were making earlier. I think the film is a very good example. Remember you said that jokes about unspeakable subjects have to be true. And yet the way the final scenes of the life in the camp are portrayed are simply not true. They're not credible and they're not true.